Hello, everyone. Good evening. Welcome to the first ever Theology, Politics, and Culture seminar, discussion, and Q&R. And can I just say that I absolutely love being part of a church that can do a Holy Spirit conference where we're all up front encountering the presence of God, and then a few months later do a Theology, Politics, and Culture seminar. So I'm really excited for our time. The topic of the evening is the oppression of truth. What progressive sexual identity ideology and conservative evangelicalism have in common. So before I get into what all that means, I want to start by highlighting a few resources that I heavily drew on. First one is a book by a guy named Carl Trueman called The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. This is a beast of a book. It's like 400-something pages. There is a condensed version of this book by the same author. It goes through all the same themes called A Strange New World. So you can pick that one up if you're interested, or if you want to brave the big boy, Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. Carl Trueman. And by the way, in case anyone asks or is interested, all of my slides are going to be emailed out / made available for the public. So you'll be able to come back and see these things. The second resource I'm drawing on is a book called The Scandal of the Evangelical Mind by Mark Knoll. And this book was actually written in the 90s, but still a very, very prophetic book for us in 2025. Two other resources I'll highlight. I don't think I even quote these directly, but they're just kind of in my mind. This book is called The Genesis of Gender, and it was written by a former radical feminist gender studies professor turned Catholic. So, very fascinating perspective, and I'll actually be quoting this book a bit more on Sunday when I just happen to be talking about transgender identities and gender. So that'll be fun. And then lastly, this book is called Jesus and John Wayne. It's a critique of evangelicalism. And I got a lot out of this book. I think it's really good. I will warn you, this book definitely is a little biased. So if that's tough for you, I would get The Scandal of the Evangelical Mind before I would get this one. But still a lot of really good stuff in this book as well. Okay. So let's get into it. What we mean by truth has been radically redefined in Western culture over the course of the last 100 years, in case you didn't realize it. And this redefinition of truth has resulted in the normalization and the unprecedented acceptance of a sexual identity ideology that argues that men can be psychologically trapped in a woman's body and vice versa. Now, what I just said is nothing new if you are a Christian and you're on any social media platform whatsoever. But what might be surprising to you is that I believe the church has been just as influenced and impacted by this redefinition of truth. And not just in the progressive churches, in the staunchly conservative ones too. So that's going to be the case that I make this evening. Let's dive in. First, today we live in a world, the Western world, where there is no longer capital T truth. There's my truth and your truth. And when considering how this change that, again, happened in the last 100 years or so came about, most people assume that this mantra, or pick any one of its forms, live your truth, etc., that this mantra came about by the invention of the LGBTQI community or some other progressive group that wanted to redefine truth for their own objectives, political or some other. So they're like, we need to redefine truth so we can get what we want, so we're going to redefine truth and then get what we want. That perspective actually puts the cart before the horse. I'm arguing tonight that the change in how truth is understood, that the redefinition of truth actually came first. And then came the sexual revolution in the 60s and 70s. And then came the LGBTQ revolution that we're still living through. And how that change in truth actually occurred at a societal level is the subject of Carl Trueman's book, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. So let's talk a little bit about what the triumph of the modern self is and what that has to do with our understanding of truth. So the triumph of the modern self changed our culture's understanding of what truth is. The self is how we view ourselves as an individual. And throughout history, individuals have been viewed in different ways. In some eras of history, individuals were primarily identified, like they got their primary identity from their family of origin. And then in other eras or cultures, it was primarily from their occupation or perhaps primarily from their nation that they lived in. So all throughout history, the way that we view the identity of the self has changed and been one thing or another based on the place and the time. The modern self, contrary to occupation, family of origin, national identity, so on and so forth, the modern self is marked by a focus on the inner psychological life as decisive for who we are. So who I feel I am is who I truly am. Not who my family was, not what my job is, but not even not who God says I am, but who I feel I am is who I truly am. That's the modern self in 2025 Western culture. Identity or selfhood has shifted from traditional external categories to the internal world of the individual. And as I've said, this shift, it didn't begin in the 1970s with the rise of the gay rights movement. We actually need to go 450 years earlier to talk about the very beginning of this shift in the self, which ended up redefining truth in the Western world. So we're going to talk about the key players in that redefinition of the self that also redefined how we understand truth. The first of the key players were the reformers. So the reformers, I'm referring to a number of Christians from the 1500s, even the late 1400s, who challenged the ideas of the Catholic Church in various ways in order to reform it. And to question authority, here's why that was significant. So, let me back up a second. So, you probably have heard of Martin Luther, the 99 Theses, nailing them on the door of the Catholic Church and calling for a bunch of reforms, mostly to do with indulgences, right? So, that describes the reformers. And the reformers challenging the authority of the Roman Catholic Church was the beginning of the deconstruction of external authority in general. So, to question authority, one has to be able to say, I'm right, and this thing that's way bigger than me, that actually controls and dictates all of society at the time, the Catholic Church controlled and dictated all of society at the time, this thing is wrong. I'm right, this thing is wrong. That was unprecedented at that time in history, and that actually was the first ripple of a series of ripples that got us to where we are today. The second was from a guy named Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Jean-Jacques Rousseau. So Rousseau basically argued, again, for the first time, no one had made this statement on written record until now. This is like 1700s. Rousseau argued that an individual is their most authentic self prior to being forced to conform to social conventions. So no one had ever thought of this before. It kind of just sounds like gospel to us today. But he proposed a human being is most truly their authentic self, who they are, before they interact with society, which will inevitably corrupt them, pervert them, distort them, and cause them not to be their authentic self. No one had thought of that before until Rousseau. And that idea got baked into this kind of seedbed of Western culture. Third, don't know if you ever heard of Karl Marx. So I'm sure this is, if you're here tonight, you probably know about Karl Marx, but I'll just say it anyways. So Karl Marx believed that present society in his day, 1800s, needed to be overthrown for the liberation of the economically oppressed. He saw society as containing two classes of people, the bourgeoisie, who were like upper middle class and the wealthy, and then the working class. And he postulated that everything about bourgeoisie society, so their religion, their political beliefs, their ideas about family, so on and so forth, all of that was purely designed to maintain their power. It didn't correspond to reality. It was simply a tool that the bourgeoisie used to maintain their economic dominance over the working class. So this was, of course, probably one of the most influential philosophies ever to be communicated in the world. I mean, so many national revolutions stem back to Karl Marx. But what's really... Actually, I'm going to save that thought. The fourth person who is worth talking about is Sigmund Freud. So he was a psychologist. He was the one that had all of the really strange things to say about sex and parents and so on and so forth. So Freud's main argument, though, was that human beings actually sublimate, or they like dampen, they overly restrain their natural sexual desires in order for there to be a civil society. And so they kind of like make a compromise between their sexual desires and having just a non-chaotic, like animalistic society. And so they make that sacrifice and they submit to various sexual codes, like don't commit adultery, don't rape, so on and so forth. But in doing that, they remain perpetually discontent. And he wouldn't have put it this way, but later thinkers would add an inauthentic. That human beings, by having to repress their natural sexual desires, are actually making themselves inauthentic. Okay. Back to Marx real quick. Marx theorized that once his philosophy got like public and the world started to embrace it, that it would be only a matter of time until the bourgeoisie class in every nation around the world will be overthrown. And so the early people that applied Marxism to their societies, we think of communist Russia as the primary example. They thought that it was just inevitable that soon America would fall, Great Britain would fall, France would fall, and communism would take over the world. And when that did not happen, the Marxist thinkers started to consider what are some other parts of society besides just economics that we can apply Marx's paradigm to. Where else can we find oppressors and the oppressed and communicate and and champion his ideas. And so as people were considering that, two thinkers in particular combined Marx and Freud in what Carl Trueman calls a shotgun wedding between the two of them. So they combined Freud's idea of sexual repression and thus inauthentic human beings, and they added Marx's idea of societal oppression from the bourgeoisie to that. And what do you get when you put those two things together? You get the idea that in order to overthrow the oppressive ruling social class, you must deconstruct their sexual norms. In order to overthrow the oppressive ruling class, that's Marx, you need to deconstruct that oppressive ruling class's sexual norms. So you need to deconstruct heterosexual marriage. You need to deconstruct having children, so on and so forth. Okay, last thinker that was important, that was Wilhelm Reich and Herbert Marcuse, who I was just talking about. They did the shotgun wedding. Last, we have Michael Foucault. He took all of this to the ultimate extreme. And he died in the early 80s. So he was writing in the 60s, 70s, and into the 80s. Foucault argued that any truth claim at all, so anything you could think of and say, that's true, gravity exists, right? Any truth claim at all is like asserting it, like saying something is true, is fundamentally an act of power. There is no truth, Foucault argued. There's only my truth and your truth. Capital T truth is a construct designed by the powerful in order to intimidate and harm the weak. And as crazy as that idea sounds, with Freud and Marx and Rousseau and even the reformers behind him, Foucault's paradigm has won out in Western culture today. And today, truth has literally become taste for non-Christians and even some Christians. Truth is what feels good to you. Because right and wrong under this worldview doesn't, there is no transcendent right and wrong. There's no right and wrong that you can find in nature. Everyone has their own idea of right and wrong. Because it's lost its transcendent basis, right and wrong is now ultimately based for an individual on personal preference. Now, not every progressive thinker is willing to take it this far. Some will maintain that morality is simply not, as long as you're not harming someone else, you're acting morally. But others take it all the way. So, with all of that history in mind, under this worldview, what is a human being's purpose in life? Why do we exist? Well, in a post-truth world, the ultimate purpose for a human being is to authentically express one's inner psychological self. Another term for that is expressive individualism. So this is how the worldview of the Western world today, at least of a gigantic portion of it that is, influenced all levels of society. This is how human beings live out purpose. They authentically express their inner psychological self. There is no real higher kind of transcendent purpose. A person's purpose is to create their own purpose. And the way they create their own purpose is by giving expression to their most authentic self, to those truest feelings and desires. And this shift in how a human being perceives itself and its purpose has resulted in has had several implications in our society. First, I want to call out is that the modern self today, it performs and it resists being formed. And so specifically in like universities and even churches, more and more, these are not places where students come and are formed. This is a place where students come and they perform. They come be their authentic, true self. And actually, it's in performing their authentic self that they are formed. Their formation comes from their ability to perform. So in the church, if someone comes in with a gossip problem, they don't actually have a gossip problem. They have a bold gift of unfiltered speech. And if I, as the pastor, try to disciple that gossip problem out of them, I'm not discipling a flaw out of them. I am trying to inhibit their most authentic self. And in doing so, I'm committing a grave violation against their humanity. Secondly, increasingly in our world, we don't conform to nature anymore. At least it's not. We conform to nature as little as we can, and rather we conform nature to the self via technology, so on and so forth. More than ever before, we believe we can and should manipulate the world around us to fit our own desires. Less and less do we submit to the world around us as a force that has authority over us. We conform the world around us. We conform nature specifically to allow us to express our authentic self. And you see expressive individualism all over politics. So let's start with a non-controversial topic. The conversation around abortion demonstrates this cultural shift. So with all sensitivity toward anyone who's had an abortion, let me just share this, just this kind of reality about how the common person thinks today. If labor and delivery are seen to be non-conducive to a woman's mental health, it's not only a necessary evil for that woman to abort the fetus within them. There's actually a moral imperative to abort that life within. Because if she doesn't, she is betraying her fundamental purpose, which is to have authentic expression of her internal feelings and desires. Additionally, she's actually acting irrationally because the fetus within her has no conscious internal feelings or desires yet. Therefore, it's not actually human. Because what makes a person human is their ability to express their authentic selves, which consciously, which of course a baby in utero does not have. And this really comes out in, if you've heard of Peter Singer before, he's a philosopher, really comes out in his argument for abortion. You'll start listening to him and you'll think he's conservative because he will deconstruct and tear apart all of the progressive arguments for abortion. So he'll examine the idea that a person's not human until they're born. He says science says that's ridiculous. That you're not a human until you're viable. Science also says that's ridiculous. The idea of my body, my choice, it's actually not your body. There are two bodies at play. So he'll refute all those arguments. And you're like, this dude is like a Christian conservative. But then in a dark turn, what he does is he rejects the idea that human beings are on a different moral playing field than animals. He's an atheist and, Darwinist, so he has no problem doing that. He then postulates that fetuses and infant children, because they're not conscious yet, they're more like an adult animal in their sense of consciousness than a conscious adult human or even a conscious 3 or 4 year old, 2-year-old even. And so because of that, he accepts as morally justifiable not only abortion, but infanticide and euthanasia of mentally incapacitated adults. And he says the primary decision-making factor should be the happiness or lack thereof of the parents. If the parents are not going to be happy by the birth of this child, they should abort. They even will be morally justified in terminating a born infant's life. Now, interestingly, he then turns around and says, although that's the most, that's kind of the bottom level truth, he says that even though it's not inherently wrong to kill an unwanted infant, he says an infant still shouldn't be killed because others would love to raise him or her. You might be able to find other parents that would want to raise that infant, and they would experience the inner psychological condition of happiness and joy. So you should find them and not deprive them of their happiness. But notice that even in that scenario, it's the feelings of the conscious self, the feelings of the conscious adult, that's the determining factor. And he doesn't take this logic back into utero, probably because of the potential for labor and delivery to be an unpleasant psychological experience for women. In line with all of this, this is why sonograms have actually been the most effective technological advance in changing our society's opinion about abortion again. And what's interesting is that sonograms have not actually changed the nature of the child in the womb. They've changed the aesthetic experience of adults getting to view those children in the womb. So again, it all comes back to the psychological experience of the adult. One more political example. So Roe v. Wade was obviously, or I don't know how obvious it is, but in the early 70s, Roe v. Wade was, the ruling was given. And then in the 90s, it actually went back up for reevaluation to the Supreme Court. And it eventually was, in 1992, verified and re-upped. It was upheld. Thank you. And the reason that was given for why it was upheld was not that the original case had been decided properly or not. The justices sort of took that out of the equation. Instead, what they said is that if they went back on Roe v. Wade, the ruling that had happened 20 years prior, it would delegitimize the Supreme Court. And so they upheld it. Interestingly, then, in 2003, sodomy was legalized in Texas by the Supreme Court. And what's interesting about that is that in that case, the Supreme Court actually contradicted and overthrew a 1986 Supreme Court ruling that had upheld sodomy laws. Why is that significant? Well, in the former case, so in the case of women seeking abortions, their expressive individualism was upheld by the Supreme Court in not overturning and overthrowing the original ruling. A few years later, in the case of sodomy laws, the expressive individualism of gay men was upheld in the overthrowing of the earlier Supreme Court ruling. So the first case, the Supreme Court ruling was upheld. The second was overthrown. In both cases, what was maintained was the expressive individualism, was that ability for adults to express their authentic self. And then, crazy enough, listen to the language of the ruling in Planned Parenthood versus Casey in 1992. This is I forget which justice wrote this. At the heart of liberty is the right to define one's own concept of existence, of meaning, of the universe, and of the mystery of human life. AKA your fundamental right as a human being is to authentically express your internal desires. Now, with all this in mind, I can't help but think about Romans 1:21 through 23. Though they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking and their senseless hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools. And this part, they exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling a mortal human. They exchanged God as the object of worship and made humanity the object of worship. They took God from the center and they put humanity at the center. The devil does not have new tricks, everybody. The postmodern, post-truth worldview, however, isn't sustainable because it actually fundamentally depends on the statement, there is no absolute truth, being absolutely true. And we're already seeing fracturing of this. So in the LGBTQI alliance, we're actually seeing the L and the T fracturing as we speak. I don't know if you guys heard about the United Kingdom's High Court ruling that when it comes to English law, a person's biological sex, not their gender identity, is determinative. I mean, once the LGBTQ revolution started going, I never thought it would get reversed. I thought it was just like, it's going for good. But interestingly, the reason that fracture has happened is not because like Christians have rised up against transgender ideas, but radical non-Christian feminists in the UK have risen up against transgender ideas. Because you can imagine, well, let me just quote Rosaria Butterfield. Here's how she sums up the tension between like feminism and transgender ideology. Women who want to become transgender men usurp male privilege and turn their backs on women's empowerment. Men who want to become transgender women deny the male privilege that has been their invisible birthright and steal false identifications with victimhood. I've heard examples of longtime lesbian women whose partner it's their partner. They've had the partner they've had for a decade, right? Their partner transitions and starts identifying as a man. And so it kind of puts that woman in this place of crisis because they've identified, one particular account I was reading, she said, I've identified so strongly as a lesbian for the last 10 years, but am I still a lesbian now because I'm actually married to a man? Yeah. And if I don't acknowledge that I really am married to a man, I am contradicting my partner's authentic self. But if I acknowledge that my partner is a man, I contradict my authentic self as a lesbian. And so it creates this just kind of like quandary, right? On this part of the lecture, I'll end with this. A world where truth is determined by the self's desire for authentic expression is a world of brokenness and chaos. Now, what I hope you don't do with this information is go find like a 14-year-old confused, broken, sad trans kid and be like, you're a Marxist, you're a Freudian, That's definitely not the right approach because honestly, all of this doesn't mean that people and children and adults aren't having these experiences of same-sex attraction, of gender dysphoria, so on and so forth. They are having these experiences. It's just a product of the broken world. And now some of it is social contagion and other things, but anyways. So the problem isn't that people are having the experience. The problem is the worldview that is guiding these young people and older people in how they ought to process and act and live out that experience. Lastly, lest we start to think, man, if only we could go back to the golden age, before the sexual revolution. Let me just read you this quote from Truman. As for the notion of some lost golden age, it is truly very hard for any competent historian to be nostalgic. What past times were better than the present? An era before antibiotics, when childbirth or even minor cuts might lead to septicemia and death. The great days of the 19th century, when the church was culturally powerful and marriage was between one man and one woman for life, but little children worked in factories and swept chimneys. Perhaps the Great Depression, the Second World War, the era of Vietnam. Every age has had its darkness and its dangers. The task of the Christian is not to whine about the moment in which he or she lives, but to understand its problems and respond appropriately to them. Okay, so at this point, we are going to take a 5-minute break. Feel free to use the restroom. I guess we don't have any beverages besides a water fountain by the bathroom. You found some cold coffee? Okay. Go ahead and take 5 minutes for a mental breather, and then we'll do the second half of the lecture and then go into discussion. All right. Let's go ahead and get back into it. So this is going to feel like a little bit of a hard right turn, but just stay with me. It'll all tie up in the end. So we've taken a look at Western culture as a whole. Now let's zoom in on a subset within the Christianity of Western culture, which is evangelicalism, which we are a part of. At least if you attend a Vineyard Church, that is the tradition that we are a part of. We are an evangelical church. Now, evangelical has acquired a number of connotations, especially politically recently. So let me clarify what historically it means to be evangelical. So evangelicalism, one, it refers to conversionism, which means we believe in a supernatural rebirth, a moment of conversion, a moment where God fills you with His Holy Spirit and you become new. Secondly, biblicism, which is just another way of saying that we believe in the ultimate authority of the Scriptures. We have faith in the Bible as God's revelation. Third, activism. This sounds just like political activism, but this includes both evangelism and social activism. It's encouraging. We believe in the gospel being spread both at home and through missions afar. We don't believe in just being a Christian and sitting on our butts. And then lastly, crucentrism. So this is where, evangelicals, we emphasize the saving character of Jesus' death and resurrection. Cross-centered. Okay. So that's evangelicalism. Now, at first glance, when I look at those terms, nothing anti-intellectual seems to pop out. And as an evangelical myself, I certainly don't think there needs to be anything anti-intellectual about our 4 criteria. But interestingly, when you look in society, evangelicals are majorly underrepresented in intellectual roles in U.S. society compared to our share of the U.S. population. So there's 20-something or 30-something% evangelicals, and 2% of scientists are evangelicals. And you could find similar statistics for doctors or astronauts, historians, sociologists. There's a certain percentage of evangelicals in our country, and that percentage is smaller once you get into top intellectual fields. And actually, why that is the subject of Mark Knoll's book, The Scandal of the Evangelical Mind. Now, I think many of us, at least myself even, we tend to think that the reason those disciplines have a disproportionate amount of evangelical Christians in them is that the disciplines themselves are anti-Christian. But the question I want to ask is, are these disciplines anti-Christian, or has evangelical Christianity become anti-intellectual? Because, when you look back at the scientific revolution, the Protestant Reformation, you even look at like the early Protestant American Christians before evangelicalism was codified. Those are all the most brilliant thinkers of society. I mean, if you look at every single major scientist on a timeline that was a part of the scientific revolution, more than 90% of them were Christians. Some of them, you'll read, were devout, pious Christians. So what happened when it comes to Christianity and the intellect? Now, getting back to that question, are these disciplines anti-Christian, or has evangelical Christianity become anti-intellectual? I think both are probably true. I just think we really only ever talk about the former, and we neglect to speak about the latter. Okay, so let's get into why this is the case. Why has evangelical Christianity fallen prey to some anti-intellectualism? Well, the first thing we need to talk about is that evangelical Christianity was formed by American ideas just as much as America was formed by Christian ideas. It's not just that evangelicals have embraced some anti-intellectualism. It's that we've also participated in our own way in the redefinition of truth. To connect it back to what we were talking about in the first lecture, I don't think that we have just become anti-intellectual. I think we've participated in some of that redefinition of truth. So to make that case, let's go through some history of evangelicalism. Let's first talk about separation of church and state. The first pioneers that came over, first settlers, it was very important to them that there would be a separation of church and state, or at least that they would have religious freedom and be able to practice their religions without governmental interference. And separation of church and state, which let me emphatically say is a very, very good thing, and I would never want to live under anything else. It ultimately resulted in a brand new phenomenon in the world. Churches had to compete for members. That wasn't the case before. When government controlled church, where you lived, you were told where to go to church. Now there's a situation where the government's not getting involved, so churches themselves are like out on the free market, and they have to attract members. That's it's so normal to us that's how it is. That's not how it was for the vast majority of Christian history. So this led to the American church landscape becoming a religious market. And guess what happened? Individuals and their preferences and their desires were put at the center. Churches thought, how can we get John Smith over here to come to our church and his family? And how can we get Paul? And how can we get Billy? And how can we get Laura? Churches started to think in terms of how can we get individuals? What needs that individuals have can we appeal to? And so, very subtly, individuals in the American religious church market got put at the center. This actually was the beginning of consumerism in the church. Now, this actually, it's unfair to talk about this as if it was only a negative thing. This resulted in many good things. There was new effectiveness in reaching the lost because churches had to actually innovate and get better at reaching people. But it also created this ethos in the evangelical movement that practical concerns take precedence over matters of principle. In other words, do what you can to get butts and seats, because that's how you get income and you stay alive. And suddenly the central questions in the American evangelical church became, what do people most want to hear? What can we say that will both convert the people and draw them to our particular Methodist church rather than the Baptist church down the street? That was the impact of separation of church and state. Next, we have the Great Awakening. So evangelicalism as a movement finds its roots in the First Great Awakening in the 1740s, and then especially in the Second Great Awakening of the early 1800s. We are the product of those revivals, those very real revivals that happened in American history. And thus, we might say that revivalism is ingrained in our ecclesiological and theological DNA. So it's ingrained in how we think about the church, and it's ingrained in how we think about God. And revivalism established two significant values for evangelicalism that endure today. First, that influence comes more from a speaker's ability to draw and captivate a crowd than from an established position in a hierarchy. Secondly, that an individual decision for Christ was far more important than ecclesiastical life, than life in the church. You might call these individualism and immediatism. So the message, those sound like great things. That's because we're evangelicals. But the message that was sent was, you don't need to go to church. You just need to find a revival meeting, have an encounter with God by yourself. As part of the First Great Awakening, you may have heard of George Whitefield before. When you look at George Whitefield's sermons, you'll notice that they are marked by a fundamentally democratic determination to simplify the essentials of Christianity as much as possible in order to give them the widest appeal. And this is actually the strategy that endures in our movement to this day. The most influential evangelicals, think especially on social media, the most influential evangelical leaders are those who are most able to communicate a simple message to a broad audience. Okay, hold on to that. Third, we have to talk about the Revolutionary War. So the Revolutionary War planted ideas into evangelicalism that we still feel strongly to this day. One such example was we can see one such example in the words of a guy named Barton Stone. So if you know Barton Stone, he was the leader of the Cane Ridge revival, which was a real dramatic revival. And he started a restoration movement, which was a church denomination. He didn't actually he was actually anti-denominational, but it became the denomination's Church of Christ, Disciples of Christ, so on and so forth. And here's a memoir of him speaking with an almost religious-like devotion to the ideals of the American Revolution. He says, "From my earliest recollection, I drank deeply into the spirit of liberty and was so warmed by the soul-inspiring draughts that I could not hear the name of British or Tories without feeling a rush of blood throughout the whole system." This highlights a broader trend that began in the 18th century, where American ideals started to be uncritically intertwined with evangelicalism. Most, if not all, evangelicals actually viewed the great conflict between the United States and Great Britain as a conflict between God and Satan. That the cosmic conflict between God and Satan was being played out in the USA's struggle with Great Britain. A New England tradition long viewed God as Lord of the battles, actively intervening on behalf of, quote, his people, which of course were the American revolutionaries. And Barton Stone even went on to call he later broke from the Presbyterians of Kentucky, and he called his break from the Presbyterians of Kentucky his new church sect's Declaration of Independence. So ideas from the American Revolution got mixed into evangelicalism. Lastly, evangelicalism acquired anti-authoritarianism and democracy as part of its ethos. So, anti-authoritarianism, basically anti-authority. In 18th century America, 1700s, anti-authoritarianism emerged as a strong cultural and political force. It was rooted in Enlightenment ideals, and it had a deep suspicion of centralized power. Because you got to think, most of the early settlers were escaping abusive power structures, and then we had to fight off an abusive power structure. So there was a deep skepticism toward centralized power and authority. This spirit so before the revolution, this spirit fueled resistance to the British monarchy and aristocracy, and it championed individual liberty, self-governance, and the rights of the common person. It laid the groundwork for both the American Revolution and the democratic ethos that followed. And this anti-authoritarianism led to the democratizing, sorry for all these huge words, led to the democratizing of Bible reading. Again, this is going to sound like, obviously, this is a good thing. It is a good thing, but we have to understand the unintended consequences. So, glad you asked. The democratizing of Bible reading is let me say this first. It's what allowed so many new denominations to spring up in the late 1700s and the early 1800s. You have Adventists, Mormons, Cumberland Presbyterians, Methodist offshoots, a bunch of others. And so what's happening is Americans in the late 1700s and early 1800s, they're picking up, from the Reformation, one of the mantras was the Bible alone. And so they're picking up that mantra of the Bible alone, but then they're mixing it with an anti-authoritarian and an anti-elitist spirit. And what that results in is the idea that I can read the Bible however I want. I don't need anyone to tell me how to read the Bible. Here's some excerpts from the most influential evangelical leaders coming out of that era, out of the revolutionary era. So this is Alexander Campbell. He wrote, "I've endeavored to read the scriptures as though no one had read them before me. I don't care how anyone's interpreted these before me. I'm going to read them afresh, and I will get all the answers." He led the Disciples of Christ. He was also involved in the Churches of Christ and the Christian churches. One of his co-leaders and associates, Tolbert Fanning, "The scriptures fairly translated need no explanation. You don't need teachers. You just need eyes, a brain, and a Bible." So with all of these foundational elements of early evangelicalism in mind, again, just to remind you one last time, separation of church and state, the revivalism of the Great Awakening, the democratic ideal of George Whitefield, the Revolutionary War, anti-authoritarianism, and democracy. With all that in mind, consider, with all that in mind, one other really interesting thing that happened during this time in history is that the evangelical church doubled again between 1790 and the time of the Civil War. And so the evangelical church went from this smaller group to this dominant Christian group in the United States. And on one hand, that was an amazing thing. The revivalistic spirit of our movement brought in many souls. Many people were saved. The problem with that time period was the anti-traditionalism, the anti-elitism, the anti-authoritarianism. And what all of that resulted in was the impulse that everything of value in the Christian life had to come from one's own individual choice or discovery. I don't care about experts. I don't care about elites. I don't care about tradition. All I care about is what I personally receive from God. That's what resulted. One more leader from that time. The very fact that I did not study a prescribed course in theology made it possible for me to approach the subject with an unprejudiced mind and to be concerned only with what the Bible actually teaches. This is the guy that founded the Dallas Theological Seminary, if you've ever heard of it. And I remember my own experience when I was learning how to study the Bible for the first time with a college ministry I love, the Navigators. Navigators were teaching me how to make observations and how to come up with interpretations and then how to write applications from those and how to find cross-references in Scripture. It was awesome. But specifically, I remember being discouraged from ever looking at a biblical commentary. And the reasoning given was, use that if you absolutely have to, but you should be able to figure out what these verses mean on their own. And you can use this method we gave you, and that will be the thing that allows you to ascertain biblical truth. When in reality, the Bible it's anyone can read it and receive truth from it. That's true. And it is an incredibly complex library of different literary genres that men and women have spent their lives studying in order to properly interpret. What our impulse is to lean heavily into the former and to almost outrightly disregard the latter. We don't like being told that what we read in our quiet time yesterday in James chapter 2 might not actually be the right interpretation. We don't want to read what a commentary has to say. So, all in all, American anti-elitism shaped evangelical Christianity's approach to the Bible and faith in general. To be skeptical of experts, even experts in the study of the Scriptures. Again, the idea is in order for me to accurately understand the Bible, I need to remove your truth of what it means so I can authentically express my truth of what it means. What does that sound like? Nathan Hatch puts it well. In a culture that mounted a frontal assault upon tradition, mediating elites and institutions, the Bible very easily became a book dropped from the skies for all sorts of men to use in their own way. So I remember one time listening to Chris Valentin. He's a pastor at Bethel Church in Reading. I still love Chris Valentin and Bethel and Bill Johnson. I know not everyone does. It's okay if you don't. Remember listening to him giving a message on the Bible. And the very first thing he said was, I don't ever read biblical commentaries. And I was like, interesting for a message on the Bible that you don't read what anyone who studied the Bible their whole life has to say. And he went on to say, and the reason I don't read biblical commentaries is because you'll open some of these commentaries and the first thing people will say is, we're not totally sure who wrote the book. And he'll be like, you can look in the book and see exactly who wrote the book. Open up 2 Timothy, says Paul. So you just believe it's... And so he basically just went on this whole soapbox as to how biblical commentators just really can't be trusted because of kind of the way they think about the Scriptures. And there it is. It's, I didn't realize it at the time when I was listening to it, but in that perspective is that skepticism of experts, skepticism of authority. Don't tread on me. You remind me of King George. That whole ethos is contained in that reaction to biblical experts. Instead, And so, I was listening to him and I was like, he had a lot of good stuff to say about the Bible after that. And so I received what he said there. But I was like, that first thing you said, I'll just ditch that and go read my R.T. France commentary, which I love, on the book of Matthew. But the problem is so many people listening to him took what he said and concluded, okay, biblical commentaries are not useful for me as a Christian. I don't need to hear from scholars who have studied classical history and learned what certain Greek words meant in certain contexts. I don't need to know about all of the different contemporary writings and documents that were circulating in Jewish sects before Jesus came about. Just me and my Bible. And so Chris Valentin is their Bible expert. And he's got a lot of really good things to say about the Bible. But he also, I guess I can't speak for sure about him. I don't know him personally. But my guess is that he doesn't have a lot of understanding about the Bible that's really necessary for proper interpretation. So because the average evangelical mostly follows their own self-appointed guides for understanding and applying the Bible, they have often been excessively skeptical about, quote, the assured results of modern scholarship. Now, luckily, Bethel is orthodox. It's not trying to extort or manipulate its congregation. But there are people out there where they're discouraging their congregation from hearing about the Bible from anyone else and then manipulating them for money, for power, so on and so forth. And we are ripe for that as evangelicals because of our history. Now, what's really interesting is that the whole self-taught is better, figuring it out on your own is better. We don't think that way in so many other scenarios. Like, how many of you are like, yeah, I really hope my pilot is self-taught. That he didn't go to any expert to learn how to fly a plane. That he just figured it out all on his own. None of us think that way. But my guess is even some of you, and I find it in myself still, there's still just that impulse of, we don't need to trust. The experts are biased. The experts, they miss things. They don't know about the Holy Spirit, so on and so forth. Ultimately, though, the problem with saying that just me and my Bible and a good old inductive Bible study method is good enough to understand the Scriptures is that we don't recognize that we simply cannot read the Bible unbiased. Craig Blasing says it this way: the problem is the failure to recognize that all theological thought, including one's own theological thought, is historically conditioned by the tradition to which that theologian belongs, as well as personal and cultural factors such as education or experiences. These factors condition an interpreter to think in a certain way. Awareness of them can be a step towards recognizing and rectifying misunderstanding. So I want to propose to you that something I am dubbing postmodern evangelicalism is on the rise in America. And I'm not talking about progressive Christianity that is LGBTQI affirming. I'm talking about a mix and match approach to discipleship. I don't need to go to a church. I'll follow this pastor on YouTube. I'll listen to this random person on social media, and I will listen to this parachurch leader on Spotify, combine it all together. That's my discipleship. Where you're not accountable to any person. Not you all, obviously, because you're in the church. But where people, they're not accountable to any person. They have their own mix. They have their own mix and match discipleship. They have their various channels and resources they listen to, and that's it. Where Christianity is all on our own terms. You see, it's much bigger than just how we interpret the Bible. It's, I think what we see today, especially after COVID, is that while all of the deeply committed Christians came back to the church, many that were more on the fringe, they've kind of just drifted into, I don't need to go to a church. I can listen to a podcast to keep my relationship with God vital on the way to work. I can put worship music on as I'm falling asleep, and I can read my Bible on my own every few days. This came to me while I was thinking about this. Progressives mutilate the body for the sake of authentic expression. Evangelical Christians mutilate the body of Christ. Truth is, we can't have apprenticeship to Jesus just on our own terms, mixing and matching according to what best suits us. Jesus said, if any of you wants to be my follower, you must give up your own way. Take up your cross and follow me. And so, all that to say, the progressives are not the only ones. By the way, when I say the progressives, I'm not putting myself in the conservatives camp. I'm like a exile in Babylon, just outside of both personally. But the progressives have redefined truth and said you can live your truth, you can have your own truth. Truth is what truth means to you. And the conservative evangelicals, although they will staunchly refute that in principle, when it comes to their Christianity and how they read their Bible, many of them will say, I don't want anybody to tell me how to read the Bible. I want to read the Bible. I want to think about Christianity all on my own. If my pastor says something I disagree with, I'll go find a new church until I find one where everybody agrees with what I think. I have my truth. Don't tell me what your truth is, and don't tell me my truth is wrong. It's actually the same spirit in both examples. Okay, so how do we apply this? I don't have amazing applications for you, but let me just give you three. One, we need to start valuing, especially in the charismatic evangelical church, we need to start valuing Bible scholars as fivefold teachers. They are gifts to us. We don't have to take every single, you can still read a commentary and have discernment. You can read a commentary and say, this is really good. I never would have understood the historical concept of the city of Bethsaida or Capernaum or Caesarea if I hadn't read this. This man has, because he's studied ancient history. But I don't think he's right about everything when it comes to prophecy or the gifts of the Spirit or so on and so forth. So you can still use your discernment. Luckily, more and more biblical scholars, there used to be a day where most biblical scholars were hostile to the gifts of the Holy Spirit. That's not the case anymore. The biblical scholars that are some of the most famous today, like N.T. Wright is probably the most famous biblical scholar today. I've heard that he's a closet tongue speaker. Craig Keener. If you've heard of Craig Keener, yeah. I have a set. He wrote 4 books that are 1,500 pages long each on the book of Acts that I have in my office. It's insanity. So, and he has, I've heard him talk about 10 people he personally knows have been raised from the dead through prayer. Wow. Anyways, okay. If you're wondering, if you're like, I would like to buy a biblical commentary set, which one should I get? They can be kind of expensive, but I personally recommend and love the New International Commentary. And then there's on the Old Testament, so Nikot, and the New International Commentary on the New Testament. Nicknit. Secondly, that's a good... Okay, with carefully honed expertise, the Bible's riches really do unfold, but they unfold as a complex mix of factual history, ethical instruction, apocalyptic hyperbole, historical myth, poetry, preaching, and prophecy. That's why we need experts. Okay, second, view your faithful local church involvement as cultural resistance. Faithfully staying involved in a church where The people annoy you sometimes. You don't agree with everything that's taught. But now, obviously, if there's definitely time to leave a church. So don't hear what I'm not saying. But view your faithful involvement as cultural resistance. You are resisting the expressive individualism of our day, which says, go wherever your authentic self is most stoked. And then finally, submit your personal revelation to proper biblical interpretation. So sometimes you'll be reading the Bible and God will speak to you you'll be reading the Exodus story, and you'll read about how this isn't my revelation, but this is fresh in my mind. Bill Johnson was reading through it, and he noticed how when the Israelites started complaining about not having meat, they also started saying that back in Egypt, they had plenty of meat and bread to eat. When in reality, there's no way they would have been eating bread and meat back in Egypt. They were enslaved. They were probably being given barely enough rations to eat. And so what Bill says is that their complaining actually distorted their memory. That's a good word. When I heard that, I was running. I was like, come on. I couldn't help but exclaim because the spiritual weight of it hit me. But here's the thing. I think that's true, but that's not what the author of Exodus was trying to say when he wrote that narrative. So what do we do with that? What we do is we say, God spoke to me while reading this narrative. Let me go see if I can find other reason in the whole counsel of Scripture to support the idea that complaining can distort the way I think. And you can find plenty of places in the New Testament and the Old Testament that will directly give you that truth. And so that's what I mean by submitting your revelation to the proper biblical interpretation. Because what that'll protect you from is one day you wake up after eating a ton of pizza the night before, and you have a dream. You don't wake up, so you have a dream where God tells you, hey, this is what Song of Solomon 6 means. And then you start teaching people that Song of Solomon 6 means something crazy. You're able to go, I know I had that experience where I think God told me that it means this. Let me go and check the rest of Scripture and make sure that's true. Okay. All right. That's it. You've been theologized, politicized, and culturized. Okay. So go ahead, spend the next 9 minutes. You can rest, or what I was envisioning was at your tables, just share something from the lecture that stood out to you or a thought that you're having as a result of it. And then for the last half hour, for anyone who wants to, I will do a Q&R. Okay? But go ahead, table discussions for 9 minutes. Go. All right. So let's go into a little time of Q&R. This is just time where anybody that wants to come up and ask a question or have a dialogue with me, you can walk up to this microphone. Please, if you can, if you're able to, please do walk up to the microphone for the sake of the recording. Okay. So, also, I put the 4 books I mentioned earlier on this front table in case any of you afterward want to come take a picture of any of them. Okay. So, don't hop up all at once. If you got a question.
I'll get you kicked off.
Thanks, Brad.
I was wondering if you'd comment on, in your studies, if you've really learned about the contribution of 2 world wars and the turning away from modernity into postmodernism. And then, you made a comment at the end there about postmodern evangelicalism where, after the industrialized killing of millions, the world started moving away from truth. What is true? If Christendom was true, then how did it result in that? And it sort of contributed to the anti-intellectualism maybe of the church.
Yeah. You can stay up for a second, Brad. Yeah, I had a World War II history obsession period in my life. Mm-hmm. I can't speak too much on that, but the one thing I thought of while you were sharing was I do recall learning that before the World Wars, Christian eschatology was much more positive, meaning people were much more apt to believe that the way that we're going to bring Jesus back is we're just going to keep becoming more and more victorious as a church. We're going to eliminate human suffering in the whole world, and then he's just going to have to come back because the world's going to be so idyllic. And then after the world wars, it was the opposite. People started saying, the world is going down. It is hopeless. We better hunker down and just wait for Jesus to come back because this thing is going nowhere fast, Mm-hmm. So I do think that's an interesting dynamic, but sounds like you have studied or learned about those elements.
Yeah, the modern period, which what you talked about, the Christian scholars who invented the scientific method and discovering truth as God's truth, all truth as God's truth. And then postmodernism came after the world wars, really after World War I, where that didn't work. And it resulted in that just, that just big destruction. And so people started questioning, what is true? What is truth? Where there really is no truth.
Yeah. That's good. Yep. Actually, funny enough, I am going to talk even more about postmodernism itself on Sunday because it's, kind of hard to not talk about it when you're talking about transgender identities. Yeah. But yeah. All right. Thanks, Brad. Mm-hmm. Okay. Who else?
Two questions. First one, it comes from what you were saying about, I called it the fracturing of the Christian church in all the denominations. And this is actually a question, it's probably just half a joke, but when I go to my buddy's house down on the lake, the last hour you drive, and almost every mile or two, it's the First Baptist Church, then the Second Baptist Church, the third, and the fourth. And is that what you're speaking of? Is that where that is all coming from?
Yeah, so exactly. Now, there's not an easy fix to that, but I think a dynamic very present there is once you have a completely anti-authoritarian ethos in the church in America, then you don't submit to anyone. You don't trust anyone's take on the Bible. You have your own take on the Bible, and if it's different from the person next to you, you start your own denomination, your own church.
So that's an accurate way of looking
I think that
at
is
that.
That's definitely a pretty related element.
Right. So the second question I have is what I'm kind of looking for are better tools to interact with all the philosophies you're talking about, especially friends and family who are either thinking that way or living that lifestyle, and how to interact in a better fashion with folks.
Yeah, I've had some success interacting with progressive intellectual types lately and been able to have some real significant kingdom conversations. And I think step number one is when you learn to speak that language a little bit, just from, like reading some, you don't have to read progressive literature. You can just read Christians talking about progressive literature, in a non just like bombastic way. You learn to speak some of that language, and you can start to talk about issues in a different way than how they would stereotypically assume you would talk about them as a Christian. But then I would say even more importantly, you become aware of the weaknesses and the holes, rather than trying to debate your progressive friend or family member on whether there are 2 genders or 90 genders and making that the main place you argue, you can talk about the hopelessness of the idea that your purpose is only to make your own purpose, And one of the things that a lot of people I've heard call out recently is that actually only works if you're in an ivory tower. You don't have the grand option to create your own purpose if you are a single mom somewhere or struggling with a disability or so on and so forth. And so, anyways, there's all in all, I'll ramble if I keep talking, but all in all, when you start to learn about some of these things, you can see the better places to focus conversation rather than trying to convince your progressive friend that abortion takes a life. You can talk about other parts of the conversation that I think you'll have more success in getting.
Is it coming down to a discussion around how you came to believe it, or as I like to think it from the view of Genesis 3, where the Lord says, "Who told you that? How did you come to understand that?"
Well, that's the great thing about the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit will open up infinite opportunities for breakthrough conversations. Specifically when it comes to engaging philosophy with the type of person I think you're talking about, going to the Bible probably won't be a good place to start.
No, I wouldn't quote.
Right.
I wouldn't quote.
Okay.
No.
Yeah. Okay. I see.
It's more about trying to understand where they're coming from and how they came to that belief. And I think what I've seen with the little I've done is you see the holes.
Yeah.
And you hope that plants a seed at worst.
Yeah, absolutely. And yep, for sure. I agree. What was your name?
John.
John? Thanks, John.
Thanks.
Appreciate it, man. Okay, anybody else? Linda.
So I kind of want you to talk a little more about what you were saying about these conversations. What you were mentioning about the golden age. It feels harder now to have these conversations. It feels like it used to be okay to talk about difficult things without people getting upset and like breaking relationships. And I mean, so it feels like it was better before. So could you speak a little bit more about that?
Well, I wasn't around, but yeah, exactly. I certainly think that our culture is more hostile to Christianity now than ever before. So if we're talking about the golden age specifically in how receptive is the average American to the gospel, yeah, I think we are, out of the golden age there. I think that comment was more so just about society as a whole. But at the same time as we're becoming more post-Christian, it's like our society is becoming more consciously aware of how bleak life is without the existence of God. And I think I see, when I sit down with my atheist or agnostic or progressive or conservative, actually, interestingly, there's a growing population of conservative atheists in our country, which is really interesting. When I sit down with them, okay, so one example, had a buddy who was a Christian, totally deconstructed, declared himself an agnostic, was that way for several years. And then during that time period, he decided, I'm an agnostic now, so I'm going to, he's married with a kid. He's like, I'm going to go visit my friends in Texas, and I'm going to live like there is no God kind of a life, and I'll be open to having an affair, and I'll, go to a strip club with my friends, and just, there's no meaning, no purpose. That's all right. And so he went down there kind of like ready to try that life out. And he said he just like couldn't do it. He was like, this is just hopeless and despairing and bleak, and came back and told me about it. And that was like the first tiny step in him eventually coming back to Christ. So I do think that although there's hostility, there's also a growing despair, honestly. And so if we're strategic, if we don't take the get in your face and try to Bible bash you approach, I think we can be really effective. And an opening to the supernatural. That's a difference. When I even this young whippersnapper up here, when I was in high school, there were way more atheists of my age. Now, I hardly ever meet an atheist. I meet a person who's spiritual but not religious.
I think there's a question in here. Well, one of the things I'm thinking about, in the work that I do, I have a lot of clients that I get to interact with that are on the very left and the very right politically as well, and I get to talk to all of them, and almost all of them know where I stand. So I actually get to have some very good conversations with them as well. And so what I've seen over the past, and I'll come back from what you're saying because I do have a question now, just maybe to restate what I thought I heard you saying, but what I've had a chance to do is interact with these clients over many years, and what I'm seeing is as what I believe to be society connecting, Christianity with one political movement versus the other, where in the past it didn't used to be that way. We could look at, let's say, more of a left-leaning political stance and say, well, they focus on wanting to help people and use government to assist people, and those are all great things. And maybe on the right, it wasn't that way, but now maybe a lot of people connect Christianity or trying to with one other political party movement, and if that's the way it plays out, then you have a whole group of people that see Christianity in a way connected to somebody that they just despise and think is just disgusting. So why would they be open to it as well, right? So, and I think that might be where that more angst or anxiety or stress, or it used to be better in the past because we could all get along. We could all have a conversation. We could connect, and it really didn't matter what sign you put in your yard. And when it was over, we could, whoever won, that was great. We could still go out and have dinner and be connected and be friends as well. And I think part of that too, and this is where we're coming back around to, is so again, I get to have these great conversations with my clients about that, and really being able to focus on what is truth and what is unbiased versus what is really biased. And so I think we can see in society a real bias starting to show up. And I think that actually will be beneficial in the future, because in the past that bias was more hidden. But it's always been there, right? Everybody has a bias. It's just like, if we're trusting in this authority to give us information, there is a bias there. And we like to think that there isn't a bias there. In the past, it was easy not to see that. But today, we can really see it in our media and so forth, where if I'm on the right, I think the left has this bias, and therefore everything they're talking about is wrong. And if I'm on the left, I see the right leaning, their bias is there, but everything they're talking about is wrong. When in reality, there's probably a fair amount of truth in both. It just depends on how I spin that as well. So I'm saying all that because I think that there is an ability to there's a desire to want the people that are giving us truth to be unbiased. And so therefore, if we see anything that has a bias to it or seems wrong, which there always will be, we're going to discount everything they have to say. So coming back to what I thought I heard you saying was recognizing that there are Christian leaders and so forth that might not want to view commentaries or even read them because one part of it might have a bias or something. So therefore, we're going to just throw everything out. And so what I thought I heard you saying was we need to be in a position maybe to, using my terminology, we need to recognize that there could be a bias there amongst any commentator, any leader that we're looking at. And if there's something that feels kind of like, it's not to throw it out. It's to say, okay, maybe like a Berean or somebody, we're going to go now and research and search that out to see if that truth plays out in Scripture, and then rather than using the bias of the person as a reason to discount them or even not to like them or hate them, it's just a recognizing that we all have a bias and there's truth there for us all to latch onto to build and grow. And at a point where we don't think that something is true, it's our job maybe not to discount it, but to go and search it out to see if it is true or not, and be willing to have ourself changed and maybe be wrong about our bias as well, maybe from we thought something else, if that makes sense. So just trying to restate what you said, and I think the fact that if we can see that things are so biased, that actually could be a positive thing in recognizing, okay, how do we find truth in this? And actually people start searching for truth then because of that situation. So I don't know.
Yeah, that's really good. That's a really good summary too. And what I'll say about your landing point is, yes, we should be able to tolerate people's biases. One, not caveat I'll give to that, but just one note to go a little deeper, because some people are so biased. It's like, how could I even how could I even read them or listen to them? The scholars that I really respect today, they are very careful about, at the beginning of their works, identifying what perspective and tradition they're writing from. So like Craig Keener, we talked about him. He has this 2,000-page set of books on miracles. And he looks at all the miracles in the Bible. He spends like 300 pages collecting miracle stories from all over the world and makes the point that 85% of the globe believes in the supernatural. It's only a small minority of Western culture that doesn't. It's awesome. I haven't read it, but I've listened to a podcast about it. But anyways, he makes it clear, like the perspective he's writing from the beginning. He's at the beginning of his book. He's like, I first met Jesus in a radical supernatural encounter. I was an atheist studying classical history, and he goes on and then he talks about how he attends a Vineyard Church and he's a professor at Asbury University, which is charismatic. And so I think that is a really good sign. But when someone is trying to say, I'm not biased, I have a perfectly objective view on things, and this is why you are wrong. I'm not saying it's not useful to listen to such a voice. It probably still is in some circumstances, but I would gravitate, especially when it comes to biblical commentaries and studies, to the more kind of honest about their biases approach. Because once you can be honest about your biases, you actually can, I think, approach objectivity. You can more closely approach it. You'll never get totally there, but you can get almost all the way there. You can't have shared truth without shared facts. Yeah. 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 Yeah.
I'm going to just talk loud over there.
I know. The future people listening to this, thank you, Diane.
Okay, this is more like about your direction you're taking the church. You emphasize the importance of absolute truth as opposed to our individual truthism. And we've had a lot of opportunity within the church to meditate on the Word, pursue God, develop individual relationships. But have you considered like basic Bible survey courses? And, Alpha, I know years ago kind of covered a lot of the basics, but I haven't seen a real opportunities for that within our church. So are you considering teaching any kind of Bible basics for, let's say, people coming from a different religious background? And a lot of times I think we assume things that maybe aren't clear and obvious.
Yeah. I haven't, I know, I can recall times where I've thought a Vineyard Northwest Bible School would be awesome, but I haven't made any concrete plans. This sort of thing that we're doing tonight is a little step that direction. But let me chew on that. I think that would be
again, not
a no-brainer,
some in-depth course like Kingdom Ministry, just something very basic so that when your average person reads the New Testament, they have some frame to put it within.
Yeah, I think it's a great idea. Thanks, Diane. Yep.
So when you mentioned the golden age earlier, my first thought was that's a lie. It didn't really exist because people have always struggled with what people are struggling with now. There's always been racism, and it's just not been there's always been suppression of different things. So obviously, paradise would be the happy middle where we are all open and sharing and not struggling alone, but also not just blindly receiving and allowing anybody to live the way they want to live or whatever. So I guess my question, if this is a question, is can you just speak to that and how would you see that happening? Like, if things swung back a little bit more towards the middle, but didn't go back into the golden age or what I might call the dark ages.
So you're asking if culture reverted to, do you have a specific time era in mind?
Well, I'm thinking because I'm of the, I kind of grew up in a very conservative household, but in that era of the sexual revolution in the 60s and 70s. And, I was very naive and protected and didn't know what was going on. But I think like where there were some things that were good, like, women were able to start, having a voice and being, respected as individuals. And I don't want to go back to the place where we aren't. You know what I mean? Where, there is a legitimate white privilege thing that has historically been in this country. And I don't want that to be, I don't want that to come back either. I love the mix. I love the equality that hopefully is being recognized now. Things like that. Where if somebody is struggling with their sexual identity or, any of those labels, that they can be, feel safe to say, hey, I'm struggling with this, and have a conversation instead of trying to hide it or, feel ashamed about it or whatever. That sort of thing. Yeah. Does that make sense?
Yeah, you're saying that, are you basically saying that more recent Western culture has brought a lot of good in addition to...
I think it's brought a lot of things to light.
Yeah, and brought things to light.
Yeah, that have been in the dark. And, I don't want to see that, revert to that place.
Absolutely.
History.
Yeah, like when did marital rape become a crime? I think it was like the 60s or something.
Exactly.
So,
yeah.
And interracial marriage was illegal before 1960.
Exactly. Yeah, we don't want to go back to those places.
Yeah. I think that what I'll say to that is something I actually wanted to say earlier. So this might feel a little bit like a tangent, but there's this great book on the history of the Christian church from the Babylonian era, so like 500 years before Jesus, all the way until like 2016, written by a British historian named Tom Holland. It's called Dominion. He's not even a Christian. I think he is almost close. He's got to be there almost when you hear him talk. But he calls himself a skeptic. So he actually talks about how most of the moral causes that we have in our country, like Western world, the United States, Europe, that we have today, whether they're on the right or the left, they go back to Christianity in one way or the other. And so he actually talks about how one of our big controversies right now around abortion is, do we go with the life of the fetus or do we go with the bodily autonomy of the woman? What's really fascinating is that Christianity was the first movement to stand against abortion. You go back, there's a document called the Didache from 90 AD where abortion is, don't have abortions is what it says. Also, Christian ideas and thought are what got bodily autonomy for women. Because before this, if you were a powerful Roman or Greek elite, you could just have sex with whoever you wanted to, whenever, So not to say that in the particular application of bodily autonomy when it comes to the matter of abortion, I would agree. But the idea that both of those actually go back to Christian thought is really fascinating to me.
That is fascinating.
And so what I would say then to what you were bringing up is I think all of the good we've seen can go back to a Christian ideal. Mm-hmm. The problem is that there was a fracture politically between Christian causes and then secular humanist causes. Mm-hmm. And secular humanism rose up and advocated for women better than the church was. Mm-hmm. And so now we have a case where the Bible is all you need for feminism. Like there is plenty in there. There is no longer male and female, right? Yeah. Boom. Yeah. But we missed that shot, and so now feminism has been totally co-opted by secular humanism. Right. And I don't really know that there's a way to untangle that. I think that I don't know that there's a way to, I don't imagine in 30 years society as a whole is like feminism is a Christian cause, not a progressive cause. But I think that we can actually find better moral and philosophical and theological foundations for the various good causes that have come about through secular non-Christian means, and then start to tell a better story to our culture and say that there's a better feminism than Simone de Beauvoir's feminism that said basically that women are trapped in fertile bodies and they need to, so we can come up with a better foundation.
Yes, God's truth. Yeah.
Yep, exactly. Hopefully I answered some remnant of a question you had.
Yeah, it's a good thing. Gets people thinking, I guess.
Okay, thanks. All right, everyone. Well, we have another one of these coming up in July. I don't know the topic yet, but it'll hopefully be good. Thank you all so much for coming.